Welcome back to Leadership In. I'm Greg McDonald.
And I'm Geoff Wallenitz.
What have you been up to, Geoff?
Well, I just got back from New Mexico. I ran a Ironman 70.3, so a half Ironman, in a town called Ruidoso, which is in the southeast of the state. It's about 2 hours from El Paso, actually. It was a bear, I'll tell you that. It was at elevation. It was difficult, but I'm kind of a type A maniac, so I wasn't going to not finish, and I did. That's the goal, cross the finish line. How about you? What have you been up to?
Well, yeah, have been loving summer in South Florida, I have to tell you. I wasn't sure how this heat would be for me, but I'm really enjoying it. I'm close to the ocean. I was in there every day this week and twice yesterday. I am doing a whole bunch of things. I'm experimenting with AI, interesting client engagements that have come about or that are in the pipeline. And just generally, I've been in Florida full time since January, and I have to say I'm enjoying it.
I mean, yeah, look, that must be you as a Canadian over-indexing on hot weather now in your life.
And living near salt water, yeah, for sure. There was a news item about VideoAmp and Nielsen One both pulling out of the MRC accreditation process. So we're going to get into that a little bit. But just by way of background, I was checking up on the history of MRC, and it traces back to the 1963-1964 congressional hearings called the Harris Committee, which were looking into manipulated and inflated TV ratings. And ultimately, it was decided that the industry should have a self-regulatory solution, including independent audits of rating services rather than something that was government-led, that ultimately led to the formation of the Broadcast Rating Council that later became the Media Rating Council, the MRC. There's been a couple of high-profile sort of arrivals and departures on this. Obviously, most recently, VideoAmp and Nielsen One. There have also been some recent in the last few years arrivals and accreditation, so Criteo, ComScore, and iSpot for some of their products. But I think it raises an interesting question around measurement and accreditation, and ultimately, how do we maintain accountability on the measurement and the results for advertising as a healthy marketplace?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts, which I'm sure comes as an enormous surprise to you. One is you probably could have given me 10 guesses and I would have never, ever been able to tell you that the Media Ratings Council was 60 years old. So let's start there. There's no way I would have guessed that. I think there's a few larger questions here, one of which is, why are those guys actually let's call it opting not to renew their accreditation with the Media Ratings Council, actively pulling out, is one. I think the second one is, what does the future of the MRC look like in a world where companies are getting, whether they're measurement companies or whether they're broadcast or cable companies or whether they're streaming or internet-only companies, in a world where those companies are getting more comfortable with grading their own homework, what does that mean for the future of the MRC? In general, I think is a valuable question to be asking. And then as a whole, the role of, let's call them media watchdogs, and where's the right place to draw the line? At what point, if there are so many certifications that certain companies are only buying into a few of, at what point does the burden to become accredited, audited, become too much of a burden to consider, period, for companies that have to maintain all of them? And what I would say at a very high level, there's great value to having somebody who's charging a reasonable fee to come in, audit your systems and say, the things that these people are saying they do, that's what they're doing. There's great value to that. But on the other hand, the question is, what's the financial burden? What's the burden on your staff in a world that we're shifting, or at least in the process of shifting from manpower and man hours on something into a world where machines are doing the heavy lifting? To what extent does that AI get audited itself? How is that functioning? What do we do in that case? Because an AI is a worker, your bot's a worker, and that's a valuable part of your process in many, many ways. So how are we actively auditing those things? And I think there's a whole bunch of questions there that I just said that I'm not even sure I have really good answers to, but I'll start with the first one, which is, what does this mean for what Nielsen and VideoAmp are doing? Because we talked about it a little bit before we hopped on this. VideoAmp's already a media transaction company on top of being a measurement company. They have a DSP. Like, is this the start of measurement companies beginning to dip into actual media transaction clearinghouses, running a media business in addition to a measurement business, the way that YouTube and Google run a media business and a measurement business? I mean, I don't know that they can compete there, and I don't know that that's the answer, but that's a really interesting line of thought, just as a thought exercise.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is an interesting question, and it's a very tempting one because I don't want to trivialize what it takes to stand up a media business or an ad network, call it. But if you're already connected to all the pieces of infrastructure, you could go and hire a seller or two and start generating some revenue on it. So it's something that I think is probably pretty tempting. And when you sit in that seat and you are seeing, as many of them do, I think MRC is maybe not a good example of this, but Double Verifier IS, who is plugged in across the walled gardens and the whole open internet, you probably have a pretty good point of view on, if I were to stand up a media business, this is what it would look like. That's a question that I'm sure comes up pretty often for those guys. And what does it mean for the MRC? My exposure to this has always been, what do the advertisers want? And part of that was spending so many years at a DSP. It was a matter of, this is expensive, often quoted as being north of $1 million by the time you had the independent auditors in to structure your process and then to actually run the audit. It's resource intensive for multiple teams across the business to support and validate the audit and make any remediations you might need to make. So the question was always, do we need to do this? What advertisers are asking for it? In some cases, it's one or two advertisers that are making the case. Before we got on, you gave the example of Disney at one point. Obviously, what Disney wants, you're going to be supporting them, but advertisers do move their spend around. And if they don't renew, then did you really need to spend that $1 million this year and all the effort to continue with that?
This is one where the majority of our listenership is in this industry and has great stake and probably a ton of opinions about what this might look like in the future. So I would love to hear in our email, leadershipinpodcast@gmail.com, or through LinkedIn or whatever, what people think about this one, for sure. I think the advertiser ultimately just cares about the outcome. I'm not sure they care about the methodology. And so I think it falls squarely on the agency to be like, this is the accreditation we bought into. This is the one you have to support. I have Coca-Cola, as a for instance, under my advertising umbrella. They have said they trust us implicitly, or they agree wholly to use this methodology from an accreditation perspective. Do you support that? And there's a difference between, in that case, right, OMG supporting that, or OMG/IPG or Publicis or whoever saying this is how we have to do this, versus just kind of like a D2C client who's just going to say, I don't really give a shit. I need people to buy my t-shirt, which is how I bought this one, by the way. But my overarching point is, the incentives between what an agency wants to do on behalf of an advertiser and what a piece of technology that helps transact that needs to do on behalf of a publisher, or the publisher needs to do on behalf of the agency, are driven and motivated by a lot of factors. And so again, what I keep coming back to is, what's the future of the MRC? I'm not sure it's particularly rosy, especially since it's not technically a government mandate. It's self-regulating, and it came out of hearings.
Yeah. I think this would be a good one. We should have a guest either on one of these short episodes or maybe even a panel. We've never done that, of some folks that are really deep in the measurement space. This is a really interesting topic from a whole bunch of perspectives. There's a lot to be explored there. And it's one of these things, as with many technologies, you commit to something and then the cost of switching is really, really high. You know, it's like switching religions. You can do it, but you have to be pretty committed. So you sign up for the product you think is going to best meet your needs, and then you probably re-up with the devil you know, understanding what its limitations are. But
yeah, I think you know where I come from on most of these things, which is like, whatever encourages or fosters competition is something that's going to be interesting to me. I don't want to go back to a world where all I could watch on television were 4 channels, but I also don't want to be in a world where there's 85,000 channels and they're all managed by 5 companies.
Yeah.
So there's got to be something in between those two things. And that's a world that I think would be a really interesting one to live in terms of how actual success, how actual performance, how actual everything attribution is measured.
All right, let's leave it there. Leadership In is hosted and produced by Geoff Wallenetz and Greg McDonald. Special thanks to Jess DeWeese for production support. And if you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to our newsletter at leadershipinpodcast.com, and you can find us now on YouTube at Leadership In.